Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Harvard Business Review Türkiye exclusive interview. Today, I'm more than happy to host Natalie Nixon. Natalie is a global recognized creator strategist, CEO of Figure Eight Thinking, and the author of the award-winning book, The Creative Leap. Natalie, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is ours because creativity is a very important topic that we focus in Harvard Business Review very much. So I would like to kick off with the definition because we know that creativity is very important. We believe that creativity should be at the center of everything we do in business. But what is creativity? How do you define creativity?
Well, I think it is an essential question to first define it. And I was very interested in defining creativity because in the early years of beginning Figure Eight Thinking, my company, I would be invited to build cultures of innovation. And it occurred to me that we actually need to start with creativity in order to build innovation consistently and sustainably. The challenge, of course, was creativity is actually not mentioned very often in corporate environments. And so I realized I needed to figure out a simple and accessible way to explain it. So the way I like to think about creativity is that creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, generate meaning, and produce novel value.
Right.
And if we understand it in that way, then we realize that it's not only artists who are creative, but the best attorneys, accountants, coders, engineers, scientists are also very creative.
Right. You mentioned rigor and wonder. I will be getting into these two very important topics in a second. But before that, I would like to ask you this. We are living in an uncertain time. Uncertainty is everywhere. Ambiguity is the norm of the business. So many people feel lost. Many people feel anxious about doing business in any part, in any industry. So how could we cope with this burden by creativity? And what will be the role of creativity in order to embrace this uncertainty?
Well, creativity actually thrives in ambiguous environments, because while it may feel more comforting to have a linear lockstep path, this is really unrealistic because, as you said, the environment is quite volatile and it's constantly shifting. So the beauty of developing a creative capacity in our organizations and as individuals developing this creative mindset is that it actually helps us to be more adaptive. It actually helps us to embrace foresight as a strategic tool so that we can not get myopic and linear focus on only one way forward, but we can actually be much more flexible and fluid and be able to adjust. And sometimes clients and others will ask me, well, what about if I work in a highly regulated environment? Well, the good news is that creativity loves constraints. And you can probably reflect on your own life when you've had tighter constraints on budget or on time or on people resources. It actually helps you to be more creative. So creativity is actually the capacity we should be building in times of ambiguity and uncertainty.
Right. You mentioned rigor and wonder. These are very strong dynamics. So how are they related with creativity?
Great question. So wonder is something that people, I think, automatically consider when they think about creativity, because wonder is about dreaming and audacity and big blue sky thinking. It's also about curiosity, and it's about awe and the power to pause. I like to remind people that you can't wonder when you're going 80 miles an hour or 80 kilometers per hour when you're going really fast. So that's wonder. But then rigor is also equally important in creativity. Rigor is about focus, discipline, skill mastery, time on task, and we need both for any creative endeavor. And sometimes people just stop at wonder. They think, okay, of course, to be creative, you need to be big dreamers and blue sky thinkers, but you also need to have mastery of skill and discipline. So one thing I like to say to people is that wonder is found in the midst of rigor, and rigor cannot be sustained without wonder. So they're copacetic, they are interwoven, and they actually help to build each other.
Great. So creativity, of course, very important. When we talk with CEOs, they want more innovative organizations. They want some out-of-the-box solutions, especially during these uncertain times. But it's always a big headache to create a culture of creativity, to cascade the creative culture throughout the organization. So how can we achieve this? What will be some of the tools or some of the mindsets that will help us to achieve more creative organizations?
Well, it might feel like a big headache, but you can either take your medicine now or you take it later. And if you don't invest in different hiring practices, different ways to design and organize meetings, different ways to build strategy now, then it's going to be a lot more challenging to all of a sudden become adaptive and flexible later. I'll give 2 examples of ways that we can build creative capacity. Let's start with who we think about hiring. Instead of thinking about the usual suspects of hiring, think about maybe on a temporary basis, maybe it could be on an advisory level, but also on a permanent basis. Consider hiring someone with a completely different but complementary skill set to the typical people you would hire. Don't go to the same sorts of degrees, don't go to the same sorts of schools, but for example, maybe an anthropologist would be interesting to have on board. Maybe a futurist would be interesting to have on board. The second technique that could be interesting to help build a creative capacity is to redesign the way that you hold meetings. So meetings are the oldest artifact in most organizations, and meetings are very telling about the organizational culture. So one way to mix around meetings is, for example, to have maybe once a month, maybe once a quarter, have meetings that are designed around questions. And you're inviting in advance, it could be anonymous, depending on the culture of your organization, for people to submit questions. Maybe the entire meeting could be about generating questions. But this is a small step towards building a creative capacity.
Yeah. I was just about to ask this because in your book, you also mentioned the importance of curiosity. And we have run a couple of articles about curiosity in business, and they really took a huge interest from the audience here as well. But it's always okay for leaders to ask questions, but when it comes to the employees asking questions, or when it comes to the psychological safety that people feel free to ask questions, then the picture becomes a little bit blurred. So how important is curiosity for creative organizations, and how can we have better environments to ask good questions?
Curiosity is fundamental to building creative capacity. So the first model and framework I developed was the Wonder Rigor framework.
Okay.
But the next is something I call the 3 I's. That's how we can activate creativity. So the first I is inquiry. The second is improvisation, and the third is intuition. So inquiry is essentially the curiosity piece. Why don't we have more employees asking more questions? Well, the reality is that a lot of us have been question shamed at some point in our educational journeys or early on in the job. We dared to raise our hand, and either we were ignored or we received giggles, and you quickly get the idea, I better not ask too many questions. However, questions are inputs into a system. The questions that you will think of, I would never think of, and vice versa. So if we gather around 5 people who have different training, different skills, different preparation, different backgrounds, that adds value to the process, because the more diverse the inputs or the more diverse the questions, the more innovative the output. So having cognitively diverse teams is a really important step in that direction to make sure we can pump curiosity. And you mentioned leaders often are a bit more encouraged to ask the questions. Leaders have to model their own self-inquiry to make it safe, the psychological safety you reference, for other people to feel okay about asking questions.
Great. So as much as I know, Natalie, you are social anthropologist by education, but you are so much into art, and you are quite a dancer. So one of the subtitles of the book is "The Future of Work is Jazz."
Yes.
So you mentioned improvisation, and with this title, can you just elaborate a little bit on what can business learn from jazz?
Oh, there is so much businesses can learn from jazz music. Jazz is something that is close to my heart personally, culturally, as an African American. It's something that my father played all the time in our household. And jazz music is a complex system. It's a complex system because it is self-organizing, it is emergent, and it is adaptive. And those are the three characteristics that we think of in complexity theory. So jazz musicians, for example, embrace mistakes. They mix up who is the leader and who is the follower. They take advantage of casual hallway moments. And a lot of these principles come from a gentleman named Frank Barrett, who is a jazz musician himself. He's also an academic based in California. He's written incredible books about what organizations can learn from jazz musicians. And I've learned a lot and incorporated a lot of those principles from Frank Barrett. So what does embracing mistakes look like in an organization? Well, a popular example that I like to use is the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Every property around the world every day has a lineup, a meeting of the team, whether you're a maid or an engineer or you work in the front of the house. And they review something called Mr. Bivs, which is an acronym. It stands for mistakes, revisions, breakdowns, inefficiencies, and variations. And every day, in 20 minutes, they just review what went wrong the shift before. And what that begins to do is to normalize mistakes. Mistakes are not something that you hide from, you share for greater learning. And what if other organizations, whatever it makes sense for a particular company culture, to think of their own version of Mr. Bibbs and daily review those things so that you normalize them and it doesn't become something that you shirk away from. But in improv, it's about the build.
One of the topics as Harvard Business Review we covered very recently is the community approach. And we focus on communities a lot because we believe that communities are really, really good leverages for any kind of thing, ideas, products, ecosystems in the business environment. So what's your take about the community approach and how it will help to leverage creativity?
Well, community is essential, even as I was talking about the role of curiosity, and the more diverse the inputs, the greater the output. No creative process happens in a vacuum. It doesn't happen only in our head. We are sentient beings and we are living in environments where we're constantly taking in data. And sometimes that data is coming from colleagues. Other times it's coming from observation, from learning new things. And the best way to grow creatively is to put yourself in an experience with other people where you're not the smartest person in the room, where you have to learn from people who are more advanced in all sorts of ways than you might be. And that's actually where, dare I say, joy comes from in work. And I think that's another important part of working in community, is that we bring more energized laughter to the process. And when we're laughing, we're present. And that's where innovation can happen.
Right. And also you mentioned the importance of the creative quotient. And the advice you give to increase the creative quotient is leaving the buildings, getting out of the buildings. So are we a little bit stuck in the operations and buildings and forgot about our environment and what's going on in nature? So should we just leave the buildings?
I think so. And I don't think it has to be in a chaotic way, right? So managers, leaders can actually intentionally build it into the day. They also need to model it. So for example, I was in conversation with a woman who was reflecting on a highlight of a relationship she had with a manager. One of her best bosses was not a time when he was going through an Excel sheet with her. It wasn't when they were reviewing a financial model. It was when he knocked on her office door and he said, "Come with me, I want to show you something." And she was like, okay. She had no idea what it was. Followed him out of the building, and it turned out there was a film that was being shot just a block away. I think it was happening in New York City. And it was something she admired about this manager, that he was able to take time out of the day to pause, to observe this interesting dynamic. And the cool thing is, you never know what you can learn from the observation of the way other people are working. And this is what has stuck with her some 12 years later. So getting out of the building is important to inform our own work. It's also important to give ourselves a pause so that we can come back to the work at hand refreshed.
Right. I remember an article saying that lots of the sustainability managers have not been in nature for years, for instance. So these kind of decouplings, loss of connections, really take down the authenticity of what we are doing. So, Natalie, finally, when we talk about creativity and all the things that we have discussed with you for the last 20 minutes, most of the CEOs tell me that, Serdar, these are very important, but it takes a very long time to create these capabilities, these organizational structures within the organization. So it's a little bit challenging. So how can we create a totally creative organization? And what will be some of the tips that you can share us to at least increase the capabilities within the organization that will help creativity flourish?
Well, I agree and disagree that these capabilities will take a long time because at the end of the day, we are talking about culture change. And culture change starts with shifts in our mindset, which leads to shifts in behaviors, which finally leads to culture change. So yes, that does not happen overnight. That takes some time. On the other hand, there are some small hacks that we can do on a daily basis that begin to shift the way we work with each other, the way we approach our work. So I've already referenced redesigning meetings, for example, building in more opportunities to model curiosity. Also thinking about building a digital archive or a analog archive of the work that has been done and having sort of show and tells of our work. So we have an idea of where have we been and what can be the build, the remix, the mashup of those things. Because a lot of times in organizations, there's just a wealth of knowledge that's embedded in people's individual heads. So to have these sharing opportunities, number one, builds connection, but it also leaves opportunity to connect the dots between, this is something we tried 11 years ago. This is what's happening in the external market right now. And here's how we might do, like I said, a mashup of those things. The other thing to do is actually to encourage the personal creative capacity of individuals. And one of the things I'd like to recommend is to become a clumsy student of anything in your personal life. So for me, you mentioned I love art and I specifically dance. I've been a clumsy student of ballroom dance. And what it does is it actually builds those three eyes. It helps me to be more curious, to be more improvisational, and to follow my intuition. It's rewiring the neural synapses, not in the frontal neocortex of my brain, but in the deeper regions, so that when I return to the work at hand, I'm more curious, I'm not afraid to be experimental, improvisational, and I follow my gut. And my next book is going to really be digging in on the role of what I call invisible work, the role of being able to step away from the work at hand, especially because of AI and other technologies. Basic tasks will be taken over. The human element is going to be more important than ever. So developing that personal creative capacity and then inviting in people to share what are the things that you're doing in your personal life, and you'll never know how that can add value to the projects that you're working on.
Speaking of AI, what's your take about AI's role in creativity?
I think that AI, first of all, I think that we're still in a balancing act, that the scale hasn't yet settled yet. I don't have a dystopian view and I don't have a utopian view. I have my friend Galit Ariel calls it a heterotopia view. So it's heterotopia view. So it's looking at the positive and the negative. I wrote an article for Fast Company about the AI we didn't see coming, artificial imagination. And what I offer in that article is that AI can be a catalyst for curiosity. It can be a co-collaborator to spark our critical thinking. Because if you notice, if you've played around with ChatGPT, you still need to know how to ask better questions. It's only as good as your ability to ask questions. In fact, the coders who designed the algorithms must have the ability to ask better questions. They must have the ability to connect with a range of people to understand the environment for which they're designing the code. So my perspective is that we can the train has left the station. It's already happening. So since it's already taken off, let's use it as our collaborator and as our catalyst to build our creative capacity.
Natalie, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your insights. Really appreciate.
Thank you for having me.